Rand, your host on 77 WABC, and we just got finished talking about all the disinformation, particularly these days, swirling around about the housing market. And I'm sure you're trying to figure out, well, where do I turn? I've got Greg over here from Rand on Real Estate telling me things, while they may be tough right now, they may get better later. But he's the only person that seems to be saying that. Well, that's not the case. I've got a guest here on the phone. How you doing, Eric?
Well, how are you?
This is Eric Belsky. Eric is the executive director of the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies. And Eric's group put out their 2010 State of the Nation's Housing Study just recently, and it's got some really interesting things. And honestly, it's probably the best source of information and analysis on the housing market that I've found out there. Very measured and covers it from all different angles. So we're really happy to have you here, Eric. So let me jump right in. Your short-term outlook on the housing market.
Well, I think right now, obviously, we are seeing and we had expected to see a pullback in new and existing home sales as a result of the expiration of the home buyer tax credit that the federal government put in place in order to try to stimulate the market. Right. And so, we've seen both the softness in the existing home sales numbers and a dramatic drop in the seasonally adjusted new home sales numbers. Of course, when they seasonally adjust, what they're trying to do is capture what they think is a seasonal effect, and they make it an annualized number. When you actually look at the raw numbers, however, what appears to be, a really significant drop on an annually adjusted basis, or sort of projected out over a course of a year, is really swings on the order of more like 7 to 15,000 units over the last several months. So we expected that pullback. The question now is, will existing home sales and new home sales go back to some level of increase? And my sense of it is that this is going to depend a lot on employment and what happens with employment, and a lot on consumer confidence. But I think it's important to remember that on a year-over-year basis, existing home sales, which is a much larger number and much less volatile, typically is up significantly, 19% on a year-over-year basis. So even though there was a drift off of about 2%, we expect to see that for another couple of months at least as the impact of the expiration of the tax credit work through. We're clearly, at least on the existing home sales, in a much better place than we were a year ago.
Now, it's interesting. Were you surprised that the financial news media and the general news media pounced on the numbers that you just reflected? You talked about the May existing home sales being down, and they didn't compare it to last year's May. They compared it to April. It was down 2%. But then the new home sales were down a lot in May, and that reflected new contracts signed. So those were transactions that were post-tax incentive.
Right.
You and I both saw that coming a million miles away, but did it shock you that the news media apparently didn't and were thrown off guard by it?
Well, I wouldn't say it shocked me. I mean, I think obviously, as you know, in the current environment, everybody is looking at every piece of data, especially about what's going on in the housing market, to try to draw some conclusion about where the direction of the market is going. And, the reality, as you say, is that that month-to-month numbers are both tend to be volatile anyway. Lots of analysts will actually do some kind of, four-quarter rolling average when they try to understand what's really going on. And in addition, you would have expected to see some pullback. I think the amount of the pullback on new home sales surprised people because it was such a dramatic drop, but it was after there was a very substantial increase. If you look at March and April, again, on an unadjusted basis, they went up by about 17,000. If you look at what happened in May, it went back 16,000. So you could argue that really what you ought to be doing is looking at what happened a year ago and kind of averaging across those months. And what you would see is that the new home sales have not rebounded strongly over the last year or so, but they're kind of moving up and down.
That's not surprising either, right?
A low ebb.
You find I've always viewed new home sales as kind of a lagging indicator on a recovery. The builders there's a lot of work that goes into getting a house ready for sale from the builder's perspective, acquiring the land, and even if you assume they own the land already, they still have to get permits and they have to do the designs. There's a lot of legwork that goes in advance of that, and it's not surprising to me at all that a developer and a builder would be holding back until they saw pretty clear signs that the market itself and the overall economy was trending upwards. Do you guys find that?
Yes, I think so. And I think, at a very, kind of simple, basic level, obviously, builders take orders. So when they get new home sales orders, they try to fill them. But in the context of what we are seeing right now, builders actually, increase their starts more than sales appear to be going up during the early part of the spring and the late part of the winter, because they were building in anticipation of what they expected to see, which was an acceleration in demand for new homes. So they did move starts up, and so for a period of time, while new home sales were kind of drifting around and maybe edging a little lower, starts were climbing. I think right now builders are cautious for all the reasons that everyone else is cautious.
Right.
So you saw permits, which is the kind of, as you would say, really a leading indicator of what the builders are going to do. They pull a permit before they start a unit. They are slowing down those permits. At the same time, there's evidence that they're also stepping in where they can to buy lots that are already developed so that they are ready to build when and if demand turns around more strongly. So
now, from an economic standpoint, doesn't it make us happy from a pure supply-demand? And by the way, I appreciate you saying a very simple analysis, because everything you get here is going to be simple analysis from my side of it.
Well, I think the reality is to get a clear picture of the market, you want to reduce it to its bare elements.
Right, and from a supply-demand perspective, limiting supply, anchoring supply, and of course new units being built are a additional supply into the market. This is actually a supportive thing for home prices over the next few years.
Well, absolutely. The inventory the correction in production, the amount of homes that home builders are building has been really dramatic, and they're building now fewer units than there appears to be growth in households. So in other words, they've really pulled back so far that they would need to increase production by a pretty substantial amount once demand gets back to a normal level. Now, household growth has not been at normal levels for the last 3 years. Not surprisingly, job growth has been anemic recently and was, strongly negative. And so obviously in that kind of environment, you get less immigration here coming looking for jobs. You get more people delaying forming households. So what we're really seeing right now is a suppressed level of demand, but a level of supply creation that's now actually even below that level. And so in the long run, that does help bring markets back into balance. But you don't see it showing up right now very convincingly in things like the number of units that are out there vacant either for sale or for rent or pulled off the market for some reason, just because demand is still so kind of artificially low. And we're only seeing now, because to your point, it takes a while before you start a unit when it gets built, especially for multifamily. We're only now seeing the number of units actually completed coming down, dramatically, even though we saw starts come down dramatically earlier than that.
So do you think that we have a chance of having an overcorrection from the standpoint of new home development, meaning these developers are gun shy now, and they did get caught with a lot of extra inventory. They really shot the moon over the last few years. Do you see them holding back even further? Because I'm looking, this Great Recession is starting to strike me as having a lot of overcorrection elements to it, which create opportunity for people that are prepared on the sidelines for those overcorrections. Do you think developers will hold back and bite their fingernails a little bit longer before they believe again?
Yeah, well, I think there are two things. I think, yes, I think that for a variety of reasons, they're going to be, careful in actually starting units. As I say, they may feel that they've diminished their inventory of land to such a great extent, and land development really ground to a kind of halt over the last few years, that they'll try to get some of that land, but they're not likely to start until they start seeing clear signs.
Yeah, it's safe to go back in the water. order again.
Right. But, I do think that what typically creates a housing cycle, of course, is exactly what we're seeing now, which is that demand contracts, supply contracts to try to meet demand. Eventually, supply may contract more at the margin than the marginal reduction that's taking place in demand. Then everything starts to run in reverse. Households that didn't get form, pent-up demand gets released, and it takes a while for the industry to be able to gear up to do this, to meet that demand.
To produce the new units, right? So supply stays suppressed.
Right. You get a period of tight housing markets, and an example of that was what happened after 9/11, where builders were very reluctant to start units. They pulled back just as demand really started to take off because interest rates were so low. You had very tight housing markets, and when you have very tight housing markets like that, what happens is people bid up prices because they're walking down a pathway with three other couples, and they bid them up.
All right, hold that thought right 1 second. I want to have you stick around for after the break. This is Rand on Real Estate on 77 WABC. Stick around for one more moment.